Ground Zero, Chapter 10, Rashmina. J is for Jihad. Rashmina paused at the top of the ridge to look out at the mountains that swept through Afghanistan and into China. The enormous mountains always humbled her. It was easy to see only the village that you lived in, and not the wider world if you never stopped to look up. What Rashmina didn't see anywhere was Passoon. It wasn't hard to hide out in these mountains. That was why the Taliban were so difficult to find and fight. Passoon had to be out here, just over the next hill, just beyond the next valley. But where exactly was Passoon going? Rashmina started walking again as she considered the question. It wasn't like the Taliban had a village or camp or base. They roamed the barren mountains and passes between here and Pakistan, slipping back and forth over the unguarded, unmarked border like they owned the place. Passoon could be headed in that general direction like Rashmina was, but how could he be sure he would find them? Suddenly, Rashmina remembered another time when she had followed her brother up into these mountains. What was it, a year ago? 2? Passoon had invited Rashmina to go exploring in the mountains, and Rashmina had been thrilled to skip out on her chores and go with him. Passoon had picked up a stick along the way and was swinging it like a sword. Rashmina strolled beside him, naming things in English. Rock, tree, sun, brother. Rashmina couldn't remember a day so fine, a time she was so happy. They passed a big rock with the Pakistan phone number painted on it, a recruitment sign for anyone who wanted to call and join the Taliban, and she and Passoon followed the goat path up and around the mountain, higher and higher. At last they came to a flat space at the top of a steep cliff, and there, leaning against a rock, was an old wooden rifle. Rashmina gasped. The rifle was scarred and dented from years of fighting, but it still looked usable. Passoon went right to it, like he'd always known it would be there. It was heavy for him, but Rashmina knew he had used a rifle before to hunt cranes and quails with Baba. She watched as her brother slid the bolt back to see if the rifle was loaded. There were 2 cartridges of bullets on the ground, and Passoon loaded them into the top of the rifle and slid the bolt back in place. Passoon, what are you doing? Rashmina asked, suddenly alarmed. That's not yours. No, it's the Taliban's, Passoon said. Darwish and Aman said they would give me $5 American to shoot at the American camp. Rashmina felt the blood drain from her face. Now she understood. Passoon hadn't stumbled on this rifle by accident, and he hadn't invited her along to go exploring. He'd known exactly where they were going and what he was going to do when he got there. Legs shaking, Rashmina inched forward to look over the side of the mountain. Across the valley sat a rat-tag collection of plywood and plastic tarps clinging to a small, flat space that had once been a logging camp. It was a small American base, deliberately planted in the heart of Taliban territory to invite them to attack it. Passoon took aim with the rifle, meaning to do exactly that. Rashmina grabbed the stock of the rifle and tried to pull it away from her brother. Passoon, you can't. They have guns there. Big guns. They'll kill you. They'll kill both of us. Passoon frowned and yanked the rifle away from her. They won't even know where I am, he told her. Besides, I'm not going to hit anything. Darwish and Aman told me all I have to do is shoot it at them. They'll jump around like angry monkeys shooting off their explosive bombs at nothing. They'll be at it for hours, and by then we'll be long gone. But why, Rashmina had said, why not leave them alone? That scowl that would eventually cloud Passoon's face every day when he was older set in, and his voice turned sour. We'll leave them alone when they leave us alone. Passoon steadied the rifle against a rock and took aim, and Rashmina backed away. Why had her brother brought her along for this? To watch? To cheer him on? He had known she wouldn't do that. Because he was scared? Possibly. Or maybe he had brought her along just so a single boy walking alone up into the mountains wouldn't look so suspicious. The rifle kicked when Passoon fired it, knocking him to the ground. Rashmina covered her ears. Passoon quickly scrambled back to the rock and hid behind it, not daring to peek out to see what his shot had done. In seconds, Rashmina heard shots of the Americans, and then the tuck-tuck-tuck-tuck-tuck of their guns as they fired back. She had ducked low, but Passoon was right. Their bullets didn't come anywhere close to them. The Americans had no idea where the shooter was. Passoon giggled behind the rock. I'll just wait until they think I've gone, and then shoot at them again. Passoon, this isn't a game, Rashmina cried. But Passoon wasn't listening to her anymore. He was having too much fun, feeling all grown up and important. And that's what he was doing now, Rashmina realized. Coming back to the present, the Taliban would tell Passoon what he wanted to hear, that he was old enough to make his own decisions, old enough to join and fight the Americans. That's where Passoon would go, back up to that ridge with the phone number and the gun, back to the heart of Taliban country. Rashmina hurried down the goat path into the valley. At the bottom of the hill, young boys from her village played on an old abandoned Soviet tank. The khaki-green tank's treads were broken and sat tilted, half buried in the dirt. The faded black scorch marks still showed where the Mujahideen, the Afghan guerrilla fighters, had hit the armored vehicle with rockets more than 30 years ago. The boys lined up along one side of the tank's cannon and pushed it, turning the turret uphill against gravity. When the turret was as far as they could push it, they hopped on top of the long cannon and rode it as they swung back down. The boys whooped as the heavy turret gathered speed, and then clang! It hit the bottom of its arc and threw them all into the dirt. The boys cackled with delight and got up to do it all over again. Do you boys know my brother Passoon? Rashmina called to them. Did he come by here recently? Yes, one of the boys told her. He grunted as he and his friends leaped into the turret. And he wouldn't help us push the gun. Rashmina sighed. So Passoon had come this way. And there was nothing else in this direction except the Taliban. The boys squealed as their Soviet tank ride clanged and threw them off again, and Rashmina climbed the next hill. Away from the river, Kannauр Province was dusty and brown, the ground rocky and hard. The few plants here were scratchy and dry. Rashmina spied a boy herding his goats up a mountain in the distance and wondered if they had found anything better to eat. She doubted it. That should be Passoon up there, Rashmina thought, a young boy loping around singing a song to his goats as they climbed into the mountains, not running off to join the Taliban and fight a war that had begun a decade before he was born. Rashmina stopped to catch her breath, stepping onto a boulder and loosening her headscarf to let in more air. She had begun to lose her twin brother in school. Their first textbooks, the ones they had used to learn their letters in Pashto, were old anti-Soviet primers printed by the United States and smuggled in from Pakistan. The books taught the alphabet, but they also taught the children of Afghanistan to fight back against their Soviet captors. Rashmina could still remember some of the lessons. K is for Kabul, the city of our dear country, the primer said. No one can invade our country. Only Muslim Afghans can rule over this country. J is for jihad. Jihad is the kind of war that Muslims fight in the name of God to free Muslims and Muslim land from the enemies of Islam. If infidels invade, jihad has the obligation of every Muslim. T is for Tapak. Tapak was the Pashto word for gun. My uncle has a gun. He does jihad with the gun. Another picture book followed the adventures of two boys named Makbul and Bashir, who eventually helped the Mujahideen clean and carry their weapons before an attack on the Soviet army. Even their math textbooks encouraged them to fight. A Kalashnikov bullet travels at 800 meters per second. A Mujahid has the forehead of a Russian in his sights 3,200 meters away. How many seconds will it take the bullet to hit the Russian? Rashmina knew that the Americans had made those textbooks in order to hurt their enemy at the time, the Soviet Union. What the United States hadn't expected was that they themselves would one day invade Afghanistan. Now the Americans were the infidels they had trained the Mujahid to fight. Rashmina had managed to ignore the calls to war in their textbooks and use the books to learn her letters and numbers instead, but the pictures of tanks and planes and guns had been far more interesting to Passoon, and it didn't help when boys like Darwesh and Arman kept coming back to tell him how great things were in the Taliban. The Nila had been killed in that airstrike 2 years ago, and Rashmina had brought a wounded soldier into their home, and now Passoon was gone, unless she could catch him. Rashmina squinted into the bright sun and thought she saw movement on the ridge across the valley. She put up a hand to block the sun. Yes, it was Passoon. She would recognize that round head and those skinny legs anywhere. Rashmina's heart leaped. She still loved her twin brother, even if she wanted to punch him in the face. Passoon was waving his arms like he was trying to get her attention, and she called out to him. The tiny figure stopped waving and turned. Rashmina saw now that her brother hadn't been waving to her at all, but to someone up on the next ridge. She scanned the top of the hill. There among the rocks she saw the shapes of 4 men silhouetted against the light, 4 men wearing baggy pants and turbans and carrying rifles. Rashmina was too late. Passoon had found the Taliban. Chapter 11. Brandon. A Hole in the World. Brandon stood on the broken edge of the World Trade Center, looking straight out into the bright blue September sky. Strong winds whipped his hair around his face, and burning papers fluttered down from somewhere above him. Exposed electric wires sparked in the sheared-off walls. Brandon backed up against the stairwell door, his breath hitching in his throat. To his left and right, what was once an interior wall was now the outside wall of the North Tower. Below him, the Brooklyn Bridge stretched across the East River, as tiny as a model train set. He was almost 1,000 feet in the air, but this time there was no window between him and the open sky. The wet napkin Brandon had tied around his face whipped away into the sky. One long stride, and he would join it, falling forever and ever. Brandon's brain couldn't handle what he was seeing, and he sank, shaking, to what was left of the floor. He knew he should move, get back inside, but he was paralyzed with fear. The ledge he sat on followed the wall in both directions, but it was only 3 feet deep. He sat, horrified at the emptiness around him. There should have been walls here, cubicles, desks, copiers, fax machines, water fountains, people. But there was no one, nothing. In his mind, Brandon kept seeing himself sliding off the edge and falling 89 stories to the ground. He tried to not think about it, but it was all he could think about. First his feet would go over, then his legs. He imagined himself crawling and grabbing at the carpet, sobbing, desperate not to go over the side. He couldn't fall, but the pull of gravity was too much. He was too high up to resist. Over the ledge he would go, and then that terrible, awful, sinking feeling as he fell backwards, arm flailing, legs churning. There was nothing to grab onto, nowhere left to stand. He was disconnected from the earth, from everything he'd ever known. And then the ground would come rushing up toward him, closer, 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 until... Brandon's eyes jerked open. His heart thundered in his chest, and every inch of him quivered, like when he woke with a start from a nightmare. He was still sitting on the floor. He hadn't moved, hadn't fallen. But he was going to if he stayed out there too much longer. The wind was living up there, pushing and pulling at him like a cat playing with a toy. Brandon had to get up, get out. The whole 89th floor wasn't gone. He could see now that his senses returned to him. There was still parts of it, off to the side and behind him. If he crawled along the broken hallway, he could make it around the corner, try to find another stairwell. but his arms and legs were lead. He couldn't make them move. Air pounded against Brandon and the floor juddered underneath him. Suddenly, a blue and white helicopter rose up right in front of where he sat. The helicopter hovered, rotating back and forth to hold its position, and Brandon saw the letters NYPD written in white on its side. How often had he seen the New York Police Department helicopter flying by overhead and wondered what trouble they were headed for? Now he was the trouble. Brandon put a hand up to keep the wind from his eyes, and as the helicopter blocked the sun, he saw two people inside, a man and a woman in dark blue uniforms wearing helmets and sunglasses. Brandon's arms came to life, and he waved them over his head like someone stranded on a desert island trying to catch the attention of a passing ship. The helicopter pilot put a hand to the microphone that bent around from the side of his helmet, like he was talking to someone, telling them about Brandon. They had definitely seen him. They were going to help. Brandon almost laughed for joy. But the longer the helicopter hung there, the longer Brandon smiled and waved his hands, the more he realized that there was nothing the police helicopter could do. It wasn't like they could land anywhere on the 89th floor or even get close enough to lower him a rope or a ladder. There they were, safe in their helicopter, and here he was, on the edge of a broken, burning building with a 1,000-foot deep gulf between them. Brandon lowered his hands and slumped against the door. He might as well have been on the moon for all they could do to help him. The police in the helicopter must have been thinking the same. The woman pulled off her sunglasses, and Brandon could see the anguish in her eyes. She knew Brandon couldn't hear her. Not through the window of the helicopter, not over the thundering blades of the roar of the wind, but she said something anyway. It might have been, "I'm sorry." The helicopter turned and flew away. Brandon lifted a hand goodbye. Maybe they could help someone else. Maybe they could help his father get off the roof, and Brandon too, if he could get up there. Brandon's arms and legs obeyed him once again, and he knew he had a decision to make. He had to move from this spot off the sledge. But which direction should he go? The easiest thing to do, the sanest thing to do, was slip back through the door behind him into the safety of the stairwell. But the only way that stairwell went anywhere was down, and his father was up. There were two other stairwells, though, and if one of them went up from this floor, Brandon might still be able to get to the windows on the world. He had to try. Brandon wiped tears from his eyes. The ledge he was on extended all the way along the interior wall to the south side of the building, which was still intact. Black smoke poured from the open hallway, but all Brandon had to do was crawl 10 or 15 feet along the ledge, and he would be on solid ground again. Brandon took a deep breath and maneuvered himself onto his hands and knees, his whole body shaking wildly. He wanted to close his eyes, but couldn't. He was afraid to even blink for fear of falling over the edge. He kept his eyes down, ignoring the open sky and the falling papers and the dangling wires. One hand in front of the other, one leg at a time, never less than 3 parts of him connected to the floor. Brandon inched away from the stairwell door toward the south end of the building. His senses were alive to every little thing, every hint of danger, and he picked up on things he would never have noticed before. The grime along the baseboards of the wall, the hint of slime the carpet left on his fingers, the smell of burning gasoline in the air. The wind whipped Brandon's hair in his face again, and as he twisted his head to clear his vision, a gust of wind caught him and dragged him toward the ledge, knocking him flat on his stomach. His nightmare came back to him then, the invented memory of sliding over the edge, of falling, of leaving the earth, and his heart leaped into his throat. He cried out into an indistinguishable gurgle of fear and despair, and he scrabbled at the damp carpet, desperate not to fall, and then suddenly he was being lifted, dragged, not toward the ledge, but away from it. Human hands grabbed him and pulled him back into the smoke-filled hallway. Brandon and his rescuer collapsed to the safety of the floor, far away from the ledge, and Brandon tried to catch his breath. "Holy crap, kid! Where'd you come from?" his rescuer asked, and Brandon looked up into a familiar face. Chapter 12. Rashmina, the Apache. Rashmina's eyes flashed back and forth between Bassoon and the Taliban fighters on the ridge. The Taliban had to have seen her brother waving his arms, but they weren't going to come down the mountain to him. He was going to have to go up to them. Bassoon put his hands down and started the climb. "Bassoon, stop!" Rashmina screamed, but he was too far away to hear her. Rashmina flew down the hill after him. She wasn't going much faster than he was now, but she still had to cross the ravine at the bottom of the valley and climb the hill on the other side. She was never going to make it. "Bassoon, you idiot!" Rashmina yelled. "Come back!" Bassoon ignored her. Up and up he climbed, getting close to the Taliban. Rashmina stumbled into the bottom of the ravine. Her brother was already more than halfway up the next hill. He was going to get to the Taliban before Rashmina could catch him. "Bassoon," she cried, "please, don't go." She looked around desperately, trying to think of anything she could do, anything she could say to keep her twin brother from joining the Taliban. Rashmina felt the vibrations before she heard it. An Apache. The American helicopter thundered over the hill and down the ravine like an angry animal. Swooping so low it blew dirt and rocks up in great brown swirls. To Rashmina it looked like a giant metal grasshopper, green all over with a big nose, long tail, and folded-up wings. Only underneath these wings were missiles and machine guns. Was the helicopter out looking for their missing soldiers? A rocket streaked from one of the Apache's wings straight toward the ridge where the Taliban had been standing moments before, and The hillside exploded, boulders broke loose from the mountains and tumbled down towards Rashmina. She dove behind a rock and cowered as the landslide rumbled by, pelting her with dirt and bouncing stones. The Americans weren't looking for their soldiers, they were looking for revenge. Rashmina heard the Taliban firing back, their Soviet-era rifles clanging like metal poles on a corrugated roof. Tung, 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 tung. When the avalanche settled, Rashmina peeked out from behind her cover. Had her brother been hit by a blast? She couldn't see him anywhere. Passoon, that idiot! If he was dead, Rashmina was going to kill him. Rashmina watched the Apache spin, its guns never leaving their target at the top of the ridge. White-hot streaks as bright as the sun shot out from underneath it like fireworks. Tracer bullets. They were so fast, Rashmina saw them before she heard them. Tut, 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 tut. The helicopter descended, getting closer and closer, and sounds of bullets hitting this hillside got louder and louder. Rashmina put her hands over her ears and winced. She had to know if Passoon was all right. If he was hurt, the cowardly worm, she had to help him. Rashmina stood in a crouch and ran up the hill, hands still covering her ears. The Apache hadn't seen her. It kept pounding the ridge where the Taliban had been. Tut, 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 tut. Rashmina kept her head down, watching her feet on the broken ground as she ran. In a few breathless heartbeats, she was at the last place she had seen her twin brother. Fresh rocks from the explosion littered the ground. "Passoon," she cried. "Passoon, where are you?" A hand reached out from behind a rock and yanked her to the ground. "Get down, you idiot," her brother yelled. "Passoon," Rashmina cried. Her brother was alive. Rashmina threw her arms around him, then socked him in the arm. "Ow," Passoon cried. "I can't believe you really left to join the Taliban. You have water for brains." Bullets struck the hillside above them, and Rashmina and her brother flinched. "We have to get out of here," Rashmina cried. The Apache stopped shooting in their direction and roared off over the top of the hill in pursuit of the Taliban. Passoon took Rashmina's hands and pulled her to her feet. "Come on, let's go," he said. The way back down into the ravine was too wide open. If the helicopter came back, it would see them, and it was clear the Americans were in a shoot first, ask questions later kind of mood. Rashmina and her brother ran sideways along the hillside instead, hand in hand, away from the battle. "You're not supposed to be here," Passoon cried. "Neither are you," Rashmina yelled back. Rashmina's feet slipped and twisted on the uneven ground, and she felt a tinge in her ankle. Her lungs burned and her heart felt like it was going to burst, but she kept moving. They couldn't stop. Rashmina glanced back over her shoulder to look for the helicopter. There was still no sign of it. "Rashmina, watch out!" Passoon cried, and she faced forward again. Open sky stretched out in front of Rashmina, and her heart dropped into her stomach. A cliff! Rashmina tried to turn to dig her feet in and stop, and she fell down hard on her backside and lost Passoon's hand. She'd been running so fast, and her momentum carried her down the edge of the cliff. She twisted onto her belly to claw at the ground. With a strangled scream, she felt her feet, and then her legs slip over the side. She was going over the cliff. "Rashmina!" Passoon cried. He threw himself face first on the ground and grabbed her hands, halting her before she slipped entirely over the edge. Only Rashmina's head and shoulders and arms were still on solid ground. The rest of her twisted frantically in the wind. Rashmina puffed and panted, swallowing a scream. She kicked and churned her feet, but there was nothing under her. Only air. In her mind's eye, she saw herself losing her grip, tumbling, falling. She had this nightmare before, tossing and turning under her blanket as she fell through the sky, trying to grab hold of something, anything, as the ground rushed up to her, jerking awake in a sweat right before she hit. Only this time, waking up wouldn't save her. "Passoon," Rashmina cried. "Hold on! Don't let me fall!" Her twin brother grunted and strained, trying to pull her back up. His eyes were wild with panic. Sweat popped out in beads on his forehead. Rashmina kept kicking her legs, trying to find something to stand on to push herself back up. Then she felt it. Not a rock or a ledge below her, but a vibration. It started in the pit of her stomach and moved up her body. The hair on Rashmina's arms stood on the end, and then, like an eagle riding a thermal, something big and powerful rose up behind her. An American helicopter. The Apache hovered in the air right above her, so close that when Rashmina turned her head, she could see the pilot through the windshield. A huge machine gun, bigger than Rashmina herself, hung from the bottom of the helicopter. Wherever the pilot's gaze went, the machine gun followed, as though one was tied to the other. The pilot looked left, then right. Then the pilot looked at Rashmina, still hanging over the cliff, and the machine gun aimed directly at her.